Hello, good morning everybody, and welcome to our webinar on standards and consumer trust. We're going to be talking today about the importance of consumer participation in standards and how that can help to build standards that consumers can trust. And today we are two presenters. Hopefully you can see us both on the screen. My name is Julie Hunter, and I am the chair of the Consumer and Public Interest Network at BSI. I've been a member of CPIN for around 12, 13 years now, and I'm also an independent consultant on consumer issues. And I'm joined today by Ceri Stanaway, who is also a member of CPIN, as a member of our CPIN steering group. And hopefully between the two of us, we can give you a good outline of consumer participation in standards. The session outline today, the objective really is to show you how consumer participation in standards can add value, build confidence and trust. And we'll be talking to you about how we achieve that through the Consumer and Public Interest Network and also the BSI Consumer Forum. We'll do a couple of case studies, and then at the end, we'll just tell you about how you can involve consumers in standards work and where you can find out more. We have two specific Q&A sections built in today. So if you could use the Q&A chat function, please. So specific Q&A function to type in any questions that you have throughout, and we will address those when we get to the Q&A sections at the end of part 1 and part 2. So yeah, just please make sure that you use the Q&A and not the chat, and we'll try to answer as many of those questions as we can. So without further ado, let's move on and get stuck into the session. I'm going to hand over to Ceri to talk to you a bit more about the consumer stakeholder.
Thanks, Julie. Nice to see everyone. Yeah, so I'm just going to talk a bit, as Julie says, about the consumer stakeholder and why they are so valuable in the development of standards. So I probably don't need to tell most of the people in the room the value of the multi-stakeholder approach. I'm sure you're aware that BSI has an obligation to include all relevant stakeholders in standards development. And that's one of the things that makes standards so unique and credible and robust, the fact that all the voices are heard and all perspectives contribute to the big picture. Now, consumer participation in standards is absolutely critical to ensure that standards reflect real consumer behaviour, including unexpected consumer behaviour on occasions, real behaviour needs, experience and risks, and to generate confidence and trust in consumers. And down the right-hand side, there's just a list of all of the relevant stakeholders that can take part, which I don't need to run through because I'm sure you're well aware, but as far as we're concerned, consumers should be front and centre in the considerations. So who are consumer stakeholders though? Importantly, it's not just any consumer. So representatives of an independent organisation who should advocate for the interests of consumers before other organisations and governments. And as I just said, it's not the same as just being a consumer. We are all consumers, but that doesn't necessarily mean that if we put our personal views forward, it's representing the views of all consumers. So consumer stakeholder groups can include specific groups of consumers that represent a specific type of group of consumers, so Age UK or the RNID, or they could have a single focused mission, so they may be focused on safety or electrical safety, for example, or they could represent the broader consumer view, so which citizens' advice, trading standards, and as Julie and I are part of, the Consumer and Public Interest Network, or CPIN. And they offer a unique perspective and really valuable insight, and their main purpose in being there is to absolutely maximise the consumer benefits that standards can offer and reduce the risk of harm and detriment. And consumers can have a real impact throughout the life cycle of standards. It's not just when it comes to developing a standard and it's already been decided on. So we can have a role before a standard is even a twinkle in someone's eye by suggesting new ideas for standards driven by consumer protection needs. And we can do that by identifying trends in consumer issues and problems that lots of consumers are having, or major problems that consumers are having, and putting forward ideas. And we'll come on to an example of how CPIN did just that not so long ago, and that standard has now been in development. Obviously, we can have a role during a standards development. We can put consumer expertise into the development of specific standards. We can sit at the table and give our comments, and we can put comments in on drafts. But we can also play a role after a standard has been published in a couple of ways, both by helping to raise awareness of specific consumer protection standards. And Julie's going to be talking a bit later about ISO 22458 on consumer vulnerability, where she's been doing a lot of work to raise awareness of that. And also by contributing valuable insight when standards come up for systemic review and putting our view in as to whether it needs a review or not. We've got an example of that. And now I'm going to hand back to Julie to talk a bit about the role of CPIN and consumers more widely.
Thank you. So Ceri's talked a bit about consumer stakeholders are there to represent consumers and make sure that we maximise the benefits and minimise risks for consumers. And I want to talk a bit about who are consumers. Sorry, next slide, please, Ceri. I want to talk a bit about who are consumers, because people's understanding of who consumers are can differ a little bit. And the definition that we use when we're working as CPIN is a definition that was developed on ISO 26000 on social responsibility, which is an individual member of the public purchasing or using property, products or services for private purposes. And the majority of standards are relevant to consumers in one way or another. It's not always maybe obvious at the beginning, but consumers may often be the end users of the product or service or impacted by them at some point down the line. So it's really important to consider kind of the whole journey of the standard and how it might impact consumers. And the word consumer we see as kind of an umbrella term, but underneath that, a consumer might also be referred to maybe as a customer or a resident or a passenger. So it's just thinking about all of those different terms. They are consumers. And one thing that's really important to remember is that all consumers are different. They have a really wide range of needs, abilities, lifestyles and behaviours. And they're not a homogenous group. So when we're talking about representing consumers, we really need to think about that wide range of individuals. And it's really essential that standards reflect this understanding. How do we do this? So BSI recognises the importance and the value of consumer participation in standards. And it also recognises the challenges faced by consumer stakeholders, because quite often consumer stakeholders are under-resourced. There might be charitable groups, non-profit groups, and they're under-resourced compared to other stakeholders. So BSI supports consumer participation in standards in two ways. One, through the Consumer and Public Interest Network, and also through the BSI Consumer Forum. So CPIN exists to ensure that the consumer stakeholder voice is heard in standards, and we have specific resource and function to allow us to do this. We are an independent network of trained consumer experts. Everybody within CPIN is a volunteer. CPIN was established back in 1951, so we have been around for quite a while, but our mission has always been the same, which is to empower and protect consumers through effective consumer representation. It's very important to realise that we have independent governance, decision-making and views. So we have a steering group, which I lead, and then Ceri and others sit on that steering group to make sure that we're operating in the best interests of consumers, and that we have a strategy and clear objectives for the way that we work. So even though we're supported by BSI, BSI provide the secretariat to CPIN, they provide funding to help our reps get out to meetings. We do have that independent governance and decision making. This effective consumer participation really helps to increase confidence and trust in standards, as Ceri said, and it makes sure that all voices are heard. So CPIN has 5 priority areas, which you can see here: safety, inclusion, digital services and sustainability. And these are the areas that we focus on as being the most important to consumers and where we really see the greatest risk of harm. And most of these are cross-cutting and horizontal issues that can be applied across a really wide range of different products and services and across a wide variety of standards as well. As you'll know, BSI publishes around 3,000 standards a year. So it would be impossible for CPIN to sit on every single standard. We have around 50 active CPIN reps who sit on committees and working groups. So we do need to prioritise our work, and we do that by looking at these priority areas and also the level of potential consumer harm. You know, we are all consumers, but consumer representation is very different to just being, you know, a consumer on the street. The role of a CPIN rep is to represent all consumers and to be objective and impartial, and to think about the wide range of consumers, maybe those who are vulnerable, and not to focus on, you know, just on their own views. We look at which groups of consumers are likely to be affected by the product or service. So quite often, maybe businesses are thinking about the intended use of their product. You know, this is what they've made it for, this is how they see it being used. But CPIN reps also think about maybe unintended or passive or malicious use. You know, how are consumers really using this product or service? For example, you know, when they made laser pointers, they were thinking about them being pointed at a, you know, a whiteboard maybe by a teacher. They weren't thinking about children shining them in each other's eyes, but that does happen. And Ceri will talk a bit later about real consumer behaviour and in how that has to be reflected in standards. You know, how children, for example, might use domestic appliances even though they're not the intended users. So we have to think about all of those different things, all of the different risks that a standard could mitigate. And we also look at the needs at all stages of the consumer journey. So we look all the way from design, manufacturer, you know, actually using the standard itself. We think about access, the information that's provided, warnings about risk, user instructions, safety, disposal, and redress. So we're thinking about quite a lot of things when we go into a standard. So in addition to CPIN, BSI also supports and provides the Secretariat for the BSI Consumer Forum. And the Consumer Forum is the way that CPIN really collaborates with other consumer protection organisations within the UK to make sure that we can strengthen the consumer voice, to make sure we understand what's happening, what the challenges that consumers are facing, and the risks that are, you know, coming out of emerging trends, changing technologies, changing markets. We have around 18 organisations at the moment that sit on the Consumer Forum, and we come together a couple of times a year and ad hoc meetings in between to share news about our work, to share insight about consumer issues, and also to discuss potential standards solutions. We work with members of the forum, both directly and indirectly. And by that, I mean, sometimes they may sit on a standard directly if they have the resources and the capacity to do so, but quite often they don't have the time to do that. So the CPIN representative will speak to the relevant organisations, get together what the key consumer issues are, and then the CPIN rep will take those ideas and that insight into the standard themselves. We also work very closely with organisations at an international level, such as Consumers International, ISO Capolco, ANEC, to make sure that we're reflecting consumer issues at a global level as well.
As I said, we are all consumers, so we all benefit from consumer representation in standards. But I'm going to talk a bit, not just about the benefits to consumers, but the benefits to everyone. Consumer participation in standards effectively just makes standards better, and it's part of that multi-stakeholder approach that we talked about. So the different perspectives that consumer advocates bring contributes to the bigger picture. It helps standards address those real problems faced by real people, including those unintended uses that Julie was talking about just earlier, the laser pointers, for example. Test methods too will reflect real consumer behaviour. So, okay, you might not be meant to put your fingers through the gaps in a fan, but sometimes maybe you do. So the tests need to assess that, for example. Make sure that technical content is based on relevant data, such as accidents and injuries. And standards developed with good consumer participation will deliver products and services that are fit for purpose, safer, fairer, better quality, more sustainable and inclusive. And this just ends up boosting confidence and enhancing trust in products and services that use those standards and can lead to real positive outcomes. These are a few examples of areas where consumer representation in standard has really helped drive better standards. I won't go through all of them, and you might have come across some of them before. One of our favourite ones to talk about is the one with the lawnmower there. Now, once upon a time, lawnmowers were big, heavy, clunky things that could only really be pushed forward. And that was how they were designed. So they had safeguards on the front so that when they were pushed forward, they didn't go over other people's feet, for example, by accident or what have you. Then a new type of lawnmower was invented that was much lighter and easier to move around, and could even, believe it or not, be used by women as the marketing went at the time. Now, one of the challenges faced there is that women largely at the time were responsible for housekeeping, and they were used to using vacuum cleaners. And the way that people in general, let's say, use vacuum cleaners, it's not just pushing them forward because they're a lot lighter, it's moving them forward and backwards. And you can probably already anticipate the consequence of this, because lawnmowers weren't at that time designed with guards over the back of them. And the result was a massive increase in people coming to hospital with injured toes after using these new lightweight lawnmowers. The result, a new standard that ensured that lawnmowers had safeguards on the rear of them as well as the front of them. Julie mentioned earlier the unintended use by children, and the fans example I gave is one where, you know, sometimes products that are designed for use by adults may have safeguards to prevent adult fingers getting through small holes while they're trying to clean or what have you, but they won't necessarily prevent little fingers getting into holes. And the food processors one is a good example. It's not just about children, but once upon a time they were designed so that you could pop food in the top, but they didn't necessarily have a narrow funnel for you to do that. So you could get the food in, but you could also, you know, if something got stuck, you could pop your hand in there as well to try and nudge that food down, with a similar consequence to the lawnmowers. And consumer stakeholder participation in standards isn't just about products, of course, as well. I also just wanted to touch on the online reviews example that's up there. We'll come on to talk about this in a lot more detail later, but I think we're all aware that reviews have historically been able to be manipulated. We're not sure how much we can trust them. And standards have set clear guidance for ensuring that those reviews can be trustworthy. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. But those are just a few of the examples of how consumer stakeholder participation in standards has made products and services safer, fairer, and better for consumers. But it's not just about making things better for consumers. Consumer involvement benefits all stakeholders. So it helps ensure that businesses comply with the law. It helps them understand what customers want and need and deliver the products and services that they will be able to sell to customers. It helps increase efficiency by cutting costs and quality, can reduce the number of complaints that businesses receive in the first place. All of those things together help to boost business reputation and loyalty, and to keep existing customers and win new ones. Helps government and regulators too. So comprehensive stakeholder consultation enables them to develop really good practice, can potentially allow for consumer protection to be enhanced without the need for costly legislation. And it can help effectively deliver government objectives, so ensuring consumer safety. And some standards, as you'll be aware, are written into law. And it helps standard bodies, helps you guys by adding value to the work of your committees, by improving the quality of the standards that are published, and overall increasing confidence in standards. So, you know, consumers are the end users of many products and services covered by standards. It's really important that this is recognised and that the benefits are understood. We're going to take a pause now, just for a moment, to allow for any questions. I can see that there's one comment, one question in the Q&A.
Thanks. Yeah, I would encourage, if you have any questions now, please type them in, and we'll just take this question from Danny that's come into the Q&A chat, which is around looking at the growth of the EV market and charging especially. The consumer protection around this seems to be outside of things like trading standards space. Is this the type of subject matter that might be suitable for consumer network review and input? Yes, I'd say absolutely, because sustainability, as you will have seen, is one of our 5 priority areas. So this is a topic that we're particularly interested in. And we did have one of our representatives and also a member of the Consumer Forum, the RIDC, recently contributed to the new PAS on accessible charging points. So we've already participated in that work, which was recently published. And absolutely, this is an area that CPIN would be interested in. And if you ever see a standard that you think may be relevant to consumers, you can contact the consumer team at BSI. We'll give you the email later, and you have to put in a request for a CPIN rep, and the steering group will look at that. The second question, how to reach out to underrepresented groups. So as I said, CPIN itself tries to make sure that we take the needs of all consumers into account, and that includes vulnerable consumers, those who may be living with a disability, those who may be older, all underrepresented groups really, and to make sure that we strengthen that consumer voice and we really understand the needs and experiences of those groups. We do work very closely with organisations on the Consumer Forum and also with other consumer organisations across the UK we're in touch with. And we would reach out to those to find out, you know, what their consumers are saying to them, the problems that they're facing. So we make sure that we speak to lots of different people when we are developing our strategy for a particular standard. And that's how we reach out, we hope, to underrepresented groups and make sure that those needs are reflected in all the standards that we work on. I hope that that has answered those questions. It's difficult when I can't see you or have any answers from you, but I hope those answered your questions. As I said, feel free to get in touch with the consumer team at BSI if you have any further questions. Brilliant. If there's no other questions at this time, I think we'll move on to our case studies now. You'll have the opportunity to ask questions at the end of that section as well. And then at the end, if there's any others, we can wrap up with some more questions there, if we have time. Brilliant. Okay. So we've talked about the value of consumer participation in standards and how we think that CPIN and other consumer stakeholders can really add value. And I wanted to talk specifically about the new standard on consumer vulnerability and specifically how this can help organisations support vulnerable consumers through difficult times. And we've had COVID followed very closely by the cost of living. And I think there's never been a more relevant time really for this standard. It's the perfect time for it to be published. So let me tell you a bit more about what's in this standard and how I think it can help. Next slide, please, Ceri. So first of all, what is vulnerability? Vulnerability is really something that can affect anyone at any time. And I think this makes it very relevant to almost all service providers, whether they're financial, in the telecoms industry, energy services, healthcare services. And it's something really that businesses can't afford to overlook because any of their customers could be vulnerable at any time. Back in October 2020, the FCA did some research into characteristics of vulnerability, and it showed that 53% of UK adults had at least one characteristic of vulnerability, which was more than 27 million people in the UK. That was back in October 2020, and obviously since then we've had more COVID, then we've had the cost of living crisis, so I would estimate that that number would be even higher now. What do we mean by characteristics for vulnerability? It's a wide range of factors, really. It can be something to do with personal characteristics, which could be, you know, your age, your culture, where you live, your geographical location. Perhaps you live in an isolated area. It can also be around your health and abilities. So by health, we mean physical or mental health, maybe disability, a cognitive impairment, a developmental condition. Access and skills are also important. So that's things like language. Do you speak English as your first language, or whichever country you're in, is it your first language? It can cover things like literacy, numeracy, and also something that's really important, and this is how the definition of vulnerability has really evolved over time, is situational vulnerability, life events. So things like bereavement, job loss, maybe family breakups, all of those things can contribute to vulnerability. And the important thing to realise is that those things are only risk factors for vulnerability. It's really how an organisation behaves, how its systems are set up, that can change that risk into actual harm. So an organisation has the ability to reduce, create, or exacerbate vulnerability. And the thing about vulnerability is it can be permanent, but it can also be something that comes and goes. It can be something that's temporary if you have an illness or an injury. And it's quite rare to only have one factor for vulnerability. It's a very complex thing, and often there will be overlapping factors. So, you know, somebody may have 1, 2, 3 or more characteristics of vulnerability that are all in play at the same time. And also situations can change suddenly. That's something that is important for service providers to be aware of, because something like a job loss can impact somebody's situation, you know, overnight. So talking about how COVID and cost of living has impacted vulnerability, some of the evidence that we're seeing, for example, health, more cases of long COVID, longer waiting lists for hospital treatment or, you know, seeing your GP. Mental health was one of the risk factors that I mentioned. Studies show that COVID and cost of living have had a huge impact on mental health and well-being. The Money and Mental Health Policy Institute said that 6 in 10 UK adults say that the cost of living crisis has had a negative impact on their mental health. And also 1 in 5 UK adults have said they felt unable to cope due to the rising cost of living. People living with cancer, Macmillan, say that around 1 in 4 people with cancer say they can't afford life at the moment. Finances, obviously everybody's finances are impacted, but we're seeing a lot more people now getting into debt, having to borrow to pay for essentials, whether that's through buy now, pay later, loans, credit cards, family and friends. And also people dipping into their savings. Other evidence we've seen is people cutting down on their expenditure. So not just on luxuries, but things like things that really are essential, like cancelling insurance policies, leaving them underinsured. So that can have quite serious consequences as well. And we've seen many stories in the press about families having to choose between heating and eating, which will only get worse as winter comes upon us. There's also been impacts on the housing market and also personal impacts as well, in terms of bereavement. There's been studies to show that there's been increases of domestic abuse during COVID lockdowns, also increase of scams and fraud as well. So we can see that from that 53% figure in October 2020, where, you know, that there was that many people that the FCA estimated were vulnerable, with all of these things happening, it's likely that more people are living in vulnerable situations right now. So what's the impact of being vulnerable, and how does that impact how an individual interacts with a service provider? Vulnerability can make it really difficult for people to access, choose, or pay for services. It can make it more difficult for them to understand information or to communicate their needs, what they want with the service to a service provider. It can make it more difficult for them to make good decisions, so decisions that are in their best interests, how they weigh up, you know, the pros and cons of something. And it can also make it difficult for them to pursue complaints or to seek redress. And this has a huge potential for harm because it's financial, emotional, psychological impact, but also these things can create barriers to access. So maybe someone can't access a service that they need to. It can also lead to them maybe paying more or being treated unfairly. So we think although we think this standard can be so valuable in helping organisations support consumers through the cost of living crisis, we see that it's particularly important to address vulnerability in essential services, such as energy, telecoms, financial services, because that's where people are going to feel the greatest impact if things go wrong, things that they use in their everyday life. And you can see to this side there, the definition of vulnerability that we use in ISO 22458. So can I just move on to the next slide? I wanted to just ask a quick poll here. So would you consider yourself or anyone in your household to have been in a vulnerable situation during the last year? Now, this is completely anonymous, and I just want to get a gauge of, like, now you've heard the explanation of vulnerability, and you've understood maybe a bit more about the wide range of risk factors, whether you could just tick now, please, whether you consider yourself or anyone in your household have been in a vulnerable situation during the last year. So I'm going to hope, although I can't see, I'm going to hope that people are ticking away, and just give you a few more seconds. And if I can ask for the results to be shown. Right, okay, so that's really interesting. Thanks for filling that out so quickly. We've got 74% of people saying that they do think that themselves or a family member have been in a vulnerable situation during the last year. So that's really interesting, and it's definitely an increase on that 53% figure that the FCA estimated. So as you can see, it's really, really important that businesses have guidance to help them support consumers who find themselves in these vulnerable situations. So if we could just take the poll down, thank you very much. So let's move on to talk a little bit about ISO 22458 and how we think that standard can help. So in April 2022, BSI published a new ISO standard 22458 on consumer vulnerability, the design and delivery of inclusive service. And this was a standard that was actually based on an existing British standard, 18477, which was published in 2010. But we campaigned, when this came up for review, we campaigned for it to be converted into an international standard, because this is something that affects all consumers globally. And we also wanted it to be updated to reflect the changing definition and understanding of consumer vulnerability. We saw that BS 18477 had good take-up and impact in essential services, which is really positive. And the good thing about having an international standard is we were able to combine best practice from 16 different countries around the world who are all doing different things in terms of supporting vulnerable customers, and to make sure that we combined that best practice so there was a consistent approach. And what we've ended up with is really a standard that we think can be applied by any service provider in any country and any service sector to help them identify consumers in vulnerable situations, but also to provide meaningful support. So the standard in itself provides guidance in 6 key areas. You can see them listed here, and I'm just going to go through each of those to give you an idea of the kind of guidance that we're offering to businesses and how we think it's going to help. One really important thing is when BS 18477 was developed, it was really, as I said, driven by consumer stakeholders. And one of the things we wanted to do with the new international standard was to make sure it provided more practical guidance for businesses. So the new international standard really contains a clear implementation checklist. And it recognises that all businesses are different, and that a phased kind of tailored approach is going to be necessary, dependent on the size of the business and the nature of their service provision. So first of all, the first section of the standard, and one that's really, really important, is to deliver meaningful change within an organisation really requires the right mindset. It requires a genuine shift in culture. The standard sets out 9 guiding principles, which you can see down the right-hand side of the slide. And it says that commitment to these should really come from top management, but then be filtered down to frontline staff, because they're the ones that are dealing with customers, interacting with them on a day-to-day basis. And quite often, vulnerability departments tend to sit on the outside of an organisation, or maybe in the risk department, seen as a risk to be managed rather than being actually part of the customer service department. And we believe that inclusive service and the importance of consumer vulnerability, this needs to be embedded throughout service design and delivery. And it's really important that someone is taking accountability in the organisation for making sure that this happens. A really important thread that kind of runs through the standard is that we're looking for service providers to take a proactive approach, to make sure that they are thinking about consumer vulnerability and trying to minimise harm before it happens, rather than just having a reactive approach and trying to solve problems after they've arisen. And the standard focuses on fair, flexible treatment that leads to good outcomes for consumers. in vulnerable situations. And the premise of the whole standard really is understanding that treating customers fairly does not mean treating them all the same. So there's no one size fits all approach. Businesses have to look at an individual customer's needs and focus on those. So inclusive design is a really important element of the standard. As we said earlier, all consumers have different needs, capabilities and skills, and also anyone can be vulnerable at any time. So it's really important that businesses are thinking ahead to make sure all areas of their service are as inclusive as possible. And that doesn't just benefit consumers in vulnerable situations, it benefits all of their customers. We quite often see that systems are designed around people who have predictable lives, who have steady incomes, who have good health. And they often fail to take into account, variability, differences, and diversity. So as we know, in real life, there's no such thing as an average consumer. So it's really important that firms are responding to this and taking this into account, making sure that they're looking at all of their systems and processes. They're looking at all of the consumer touch points. And by that, I mean any point where the consumer may interact with the business. So that might be contact centres, published materials, bills, websites, complaints processes. It's really important that all of those are as inclusive as possible so that all consumers find them easy to use. Obviously, this brings benefits to consumers, but it can also, by applying inclusive service, businesses can reduce barriers and unintentional harm. They make services fairer and more accessible for everybody, prevent problems occurring in the first place, and it can also help them to increase customers and reduce complaints. And it's really important that consumers are involved in service design so that it's meeting, real consumer needs. So something that's really important part of the standard is identifying vulnerability. And often vulnerability is hidden. It's kind of invisible. People are often reluctant to talk about their personal situations, particularly to their energy provider or their bank. And they don't often see themselves as vulnerable. They might not recognise themselves as vulnerable, and they might be unwilling to share that information. So the real challenge here is how can service providers help people if they don't know who they are? So there's three key elements to this. One is understanding vulnerability. The standard really sets out that service providers need to understand their customer base. And they can do that through talking to people who have lived experience of vulnerability, like actually speak to vulnerable consumers, or organisations that represent them. Also to take a look at data to find out, what the demographic is, what's the demographic in their area of their customer base, and also to build partnerships with those organisations. For example, we've spoken to energy companies who have got like Macmillan or the Alzheimer's Society to come into their business and run training days for staff so that they can understand, different types of vulnerability and how that impacts people's lives. Recognising consumers who may be in vulnerable situations, that can be done through training your staff about risk factors, the impact on individuals, because they can then maybe observe certain signs or like triggers that customers are displaying, certain things that a customer might say to show that they're vulnerable. They might say they're having difficulty understanding information. They might say that they might have difficulty remembering things like their address or their telephone number. These are things that should really be flags for staff to, to ask more questions, really, to try and understand what's going on, because someone's not going to just ring up and say, hello, I'm vulnerable. Automated systems can also help. So, for example, in a bank, lots of banks have set up systems by which someone, it will raise a flag if someone suddenly starts spending lots more money than they usually do, or suddenly starts missing payments. Those kind of things can be flags that something else is going on. And the third part is around encouraging conversations. And at the beginning of this standard, I was the consumer representative on this standard, and I was also the project leader. And what we did was we ran a stakeholder workshop with consumer stakeholders at the beginning of the process, with lots of different consumer organisations and charities. And one thing that they said was it's really important to encourage conversations, to get people to disclose their situation. So it's about being sensitive and tactful in questioning to understand what it is that individual is actually going through, but actually what they need from the organisation. So another part of the standard, which is really important, is how to provide meaningful support. Now, this is not just about having, you know, a list of 3 things, 3 response options, and you just, you know, apply them all to each customer in the same way. It's about having tailored and flexible response options that actually address the difficulty that's being experienced. So within the standard, we focus on the difficulty, not the risk factor, but the difficulty. Is it that they're having difficulty accessing the service, remembering things, understanding information, communicating or making payments? And then the standard makes recommendations for the sorts of responses that can help with those difficulties. So, for example, if someone's having difficulty understanding information, could the business offer to provide that information in another format? Or perhaps they could get an advisor to call that customer and explain, you know, a contract or whatever it is verbally. If an individual is having difficulty paying, maybe the service provider can offer a payment break. Perhaps they could suggest a new tariff or a new payment plan that is easier for the customer to repay. And another thing is, you know, they might be able to, if they're going through challenging circumstances, can the service provider maybe signpost to external advice and support? So if somebody is in debt, can they signpost to an external organisation that can give specialist advice on that? So it's really important for staff to kind of review the current service provision and also to involve the consumer in the decision-making process. So it's about saying, these are the options available to you, which ones do you think are going to help? And one other thing that the standard covers is third parties, because quite often vulnerable consumers will have a family member or a friend that they're asking to act on their behalf. And the standard goes through, you know, how to verify that somebody can do that, and about involving them as well where it's appropriate to do so. These meaningful responses, the main purpose, of course, is to make life easier for the individual and to reduce the risk of harm for that customer. But it's also about preventing other consumers who might be experiencing similar problems from experiencing harm in the future as well. So perhaps if lots of consumers have flagged up that there's an issue on your website and that it's impossible to understand a particular section, the service provider should be looking at amending that so that it's easier for everybody else in the future, just making sure it doesn't happen again. So finally, the final section of the standards is around evolution of service. I spoke at the beginning, I think, about how the risks to consumers are constantly evolving. So we have like changing markets, new technology, consumer behaviour is always changing, and also those external factors are always changing as well. And they're creating new risks. So an organisation can't just say, right, I've used my checklist now to make sure that my service is inclusive. I've done that, and now I'm just going to move on and forget about it. It's something that needs to be monitored and continually evolved. It's important that organisations listen to consumers and learn from them. So that might be through customer satisfaction surveys, staff feedback. Maybe they should speak specifically to vulnerable consumers to say, you know, what was the outcome of your complaint or your situation? Are you happy with it? It's also about talking to staff, because staff can have very valuable feedback on how things are working. You know, this has worked, this hasn't worked. How can we improve? And it's also about looking at aggregated data from customer records to make sure that that's being used in a smart way for the benefit of consumers as well. Service providers that use this standard can increase consumer confidence, boost their reputation and loyalty for treating consumers fairly, and also doing the right thing. It's a way for them to demonstrate that they're doing the right thing for their consumers. We have ambitions, I guess, for how the standard is used. As I said before, we've seen that the previous British standard was used in the area of essential services, and it was referenced by regulators as a way for firms to meet their vulnerability obligations. So we would hope to see the new international standard being used in that way as well. Because if regulators say that their firms have to follow it, that's a really good way to ensure that as many customers as possible are benefiting from this good practice. We're hoping that the standard can help service providers increase their understanding of vulnerability, show them what good practice is, because lots of service providers obviously want to do the right thing, but they can't always understand what that is or where do they start. So the standard can actually spell out what they need to do to implement that. We believe that the standard can provide a consistent framework for sector-specific guidance. So it gives overarching principles, and it could help to support guidance that's available in specific sectors or service sectors. And overall, we really hope that it can improve outcomes, minimise risks, and reduce harm for all consumers in vulnerable situations. As we know, potentially that could be anyone. I'm going to move on now. I'll hand over to Ceri to talk to you a little bit about digital markets and consumer trust. And I just encourage you while we're talking, so don't forget to pop your questions in the chat and we'll deal with them at the end of this session. Thanks, Ceri.
Thanks, Julie. Hello again, everyone. So as Julie says, I'm going to talk a little bit about how consumer involvements and standards that are relevant in the digital marketplace has really benefited those standards, and how those standards have been able to, or will be able to, protect consumers from harm and also open up opportunities for consumers. Just starting off by talking about the digital marketplace more widely. The world is becoming more digital, and while that presents lots of opportunities, and we can buy things from all over the world now that we never used to be able to, there are also challenges involved in that. And these are just a few of them. I won't go through them all in detail, but difficulty in making decisions. I mentioned earlier the challenges that online reviews can pose if they're fake, that can skew decisions. There can be a lack of transparency over how things on a price comparison site are listed, for example. Are the ones at the top really the best, or are they sponsored? Online marketing can be influenced by artificial intelligence, and it's not necessarily always super clear. There can be unfair treatment. So some people don't have access to the internet and therefore don't have the same breadth of choice that those who do have access to the internet do have. Or we might find that we're unable to buy things that are available in other parts of the world because of geo-blocking. There are privacy and security risks. Julie mentioned earlier in her discussion about vulnerability, the issue of fraud, which has risen exponentially and was a major issue during COVID in particular. And there are also concerns about the safety and security and privacy of our personal information, even if it's not being used for criminal purposes. There's the potential for us to buy unsafe goods. We can't, when we buy things digitally, when we buy things online, we can't see them before we buy them. And there are unscrupulous sellers out there. We know that. And we know that standards can't help with criminal activity, but they can help responsible businesses reduce the risk of unsafe goods appearing on their services in the first place. Getting redress. Sometimes buying something involves, or attaining a service from someone involves actually several different service or product suppliers, and it can sometimes be difficult to identify exactly who is responsible for dealing with complaints these days. We can think about the environmental impact of that all of the deliveries and the packaging that we're receiving these days can pose. And there's also the issue of different market surveillance and enforcement. When we're buying things globally, different standards might apply to, or regulation might apply to what applies in our own country, and it can sometimes be difficult to trace sellers. So that's just an overall flavour of the challenges that are facing us as consumers in digital markets. So, and I'm now going to go on to talk about three standard solutions that CPIN has been involved in. And how we've been involved actually at different stages, coming back to what we talked about earlier in the presentation about how consumers can be involved at different stages. And the first one is one which is in its very early stages at the moment, and CPIN was involved before it even started. I'll talk about that in a minute, which is a new work item on online terms and conditions. Before I kick off with that, though, I wanted to do a couple of quick polls to find out whether you read online terms and conditions. Again, as Julie said, these are anonymous, though I'm hoping this won't be quite as sensitive as Julie's poll. So the first poll is simply, do you read online terms and conditions? Always, sometimes, hardly, ever, or never. Those are the things that can pop up every time we want to buy something or use an online service that says, have you accepted these terms and conditions? And often you have to click to open a separate box or scroll through an endless tiny screen. Wow, I'm very impressed by the 11% of you who say you always read online terms and conditions, because I am certainly not one of those people. I quite often open it quickly, look at it in horror at just how long it is, and give up and say it'll probably be okay. I believe that the other group of people, I would say, so I sometimes read terms and conditions, but probably less often than I should, and probably only for the very important things. So basically, we're saying that nearly 90% of people, based on our sample size here, don't always read those important terms and conditions. So the next poll is going to cover what would encourage you to read online terms and conditions, if anything. So there are 3 things up there that we think would probably help. So the terms that matter the most being clearly highlighted, knowing that they'd only take a minute or 2 to read and understand, and terms and conditions being written in plain English rather than legal speak. So you can pick as many of those that apply, or if none of those would encourage you to read online terms and conditions, just tick none of the above. I'll give you a few more seconds for this one. Well, the good news is that most of the options that I've suggested would actually make a difference. So 70% or more of people say that each of the points would make a difference. Not surprised that knowing they'd only take a minute or 2 to read is the first one up there. And then only a few of you saying that none of those options would help. So that's really good news, given that we're developing a standard which is about helping aid consumer understanding of online terms and conditions. So to kick off, why don't consumers read and understand terms and conditions? I've already mentioned how endlessly long they can be sometimes. So these are just some stats that really give reason to why people tend not to read online terms and conditions. So the printed length of Airbnb's terms and conditions, 39 meters. Imagine trying to get through that on a tiny mobile screen. It would take more than 3 hours to read the terms of service and privacy notices of the 5 most popular social media and messaging apps. 76 days it would take to the average person to read a year's worth of online terms and conditions based on the services they typically use and the products they typically buy. And I don't know about you, but I certainly don't have anywhere near that amount of time to dedicate to reading online terms and conditions. And then small wonder that less than 10%, so about the same number as we said always read terms and conditions, of online shoppers always read terms and conditions. And that Hamlet example is just an allusion to the fact that PayPal's terms are longer than Hamlet, one of Shakespeare's most famous plays, obviously. I'm just noticing in the chat that Julie's replying to, so the terms are usually so long you have no chance reading them. Yes, I completely agree, you're absolutely right. I can see Julie's typing an answer to that. Known issues with online terms and conditions. So why does it actually matter that we read those online terms and conditions and that we understand those online terms and conditions? Well, there's an imbalance of power. So the terms and conditions are effectively our contract with the provider we're dealing with. And they're the ones that, the contracts that are driving B2C business to consumer e-commerce. But the problem is that online retailers are in full control of the terms, often with a contract that we're making with another individual. You know, you agree the terms of the contract, but we have no choice but to accept the terms of the contract or not buy the thing. There's a quote over to the right there from the European Commission, which says if they want to complete the purchase, consumers have no other choice than accepting the terms and conditions. But blindly accepting them may be costly because we may end up with a contract that we wouldn't have signed had we known. They can be incredibly long, incredibly complicated, full of legal speak, and just put us all off reading them. Even when we do give it a try, they can be very difficult to understand. And there's some research that shows that privacy policies, for example, frequently require college level reading ability, whereas in reality, our average reading ability is not that high. And there are risks of harm by not reading and understanding terms and conditions. Our decisions may be less well informed, so we might be unaware of additional charges or early termination fees, or the fact that we can't cancel, or how personal data will be used. And consumers in vulnerable situations in particular may be at a greater risk of harm. And all of that just leads to a greater likelihood of consumers experiencing harm in general. So the standards solution, a new work item is underway on guidelines for organisations to increase consumer understanding of online terms and conditions. It's not about saying what should be in the terms and conditions. It's not saying, telling businesses what they need to charge or how they need to manage their business, but it is designed to help them make sure that the consumers they're working with fully understand what they're signing up for. So it won't cover what shouldn't be included or any sort of precise wording, but the idea is that at least by consumers knowing what they're getting and understanding what they're getting, it will help build consumer confidence and trust, and will also aid responsible business practice and help national governments potentially protect consumers by ensuring the right information is there. I mentioned that this was something where CPIN had been involved right from the very beginning, and this was actually a twinkle in CPIN's eye quite some time ago, as informed by a base guide on best practice for terms and conditions, consumer understanding of terms and conditions. And based on that, we developed a new work item proposal that we put forward through the BSI, and was approved by ISO Capolco and confirmed by ISO. And it was all about the fact that, we operate internationally, and so therefore an international standard seemed to us to be the right solution. There are benefits to industry, governments and consumers alike. So it offers a clear set of requirements for industry, helps them improve customer satisfaction, reduce the risk of consumers returning things potentially because they didn't understand the terms and conditions, avoids costly complaints if they realise they can't return things or they're going to pay a fee to do so, and reduces the risk of reputational damage and builds their consumer trust as a better business, a business that you can trust to buy from. I've talked about some of the benefits for consumers, but it ensures they can make fully informed decisions before they buy, reduces the risk of harm, improves the general understanding of rights and responsibilities, and makes it easier for them to identify the right businesses to deal with. And for government, who, as we've seen from the base guide, obviously have their mind on things like this, it's a market-sensitive solution which protects consumers, offers consumer protection without the cost of legislation, potentially if it's widely adopted, improves access to global e-commerce markets, and may assist in monitoring of regulatory compliance. Now I'm going to have a quick talk about another standard that we've worked on. This is one we got heavily stuck into when it came up for development. So that's ISO 20488 online consumer reviews. There are benefits and risks to online reviews, and I touched on this a little earlier. So the benefits of the online review culture to businesses, it means that if they offer high quality products and services, they should naturally rise to the top, assuming that the reviews are all genuine. That means they'll get more business. It also means that even if they're not such great reviews, that it's an opportunity for responsible businesses to learn from feedback. And it helps boost consumer confidence in online purchases and makes consumers more likely to buy with confidence. For consumers, reviews are great. Most people I know will check reviews before they make a purchase these days. It helps to make informed decisions when transacting online, and also as an individual, if I have a bad experience or a great experience, it gives me the ability to provide feedback that I know will either help other consumers or potentially hold the business to account. But Fake reviews can mislead consumers and increase complaints. So it's not good news generally for businesses if they have fake reviews. And it can be damaging to business reputation ultimately and impact sales. And from a consumer's perspective, we know that online reviews influence consumer behaviour, but they're really worryingly prevalent. So the consumer organisation, for example, found Amazon products with 5-star reviews or labelled as Amazon choice when the products were actually poor quality and unsafe, and it's very likely that those reviews were fake. And if there is a culture of fake reviews, it leaves people unable to trust reviews in order to be able to make those informed decisions that they want to be able to make. Standard solution then, this is being published already, is BS ISO 20488 online consumer reviews, principles and requirements for their collection, moderation and publication. And the key purpose of this standard is to help those that administer reviews for businesses demonstrate commitments and raise consumer trust by helping to ensure that their reviews can be trusted. So it gives consumers confidence that the reviews are real and can be trusted. Also gives them confidence that their personal details can be protected. And it gives businesses that sight of what their consumers are saying about them with confidence that the reviews are real. And as I said, ultimately, it helps review administrators to demonstrate that commitment to providing reviews that consumers can trust. So some of the key principles addressed by the online reviews standards. So I mentioned privacy and security, so ensures that data protection best practice is followed when people are submitting reviews. It allows reviews to be published with the public name as a nickname rather than their full name being published. So don't worry about being singled out for criticism because they published a review, although the real name will be available only to the administrators. Terms and conditions, we've just talked a lot about online terms and conditions, but one of the key points of this standard is that the rules for consumers and suppliers must be clear and accessible. All reviews must be dealt with in a fair, unbiased and consistent way, regardless of whether the content is positive or negative. So there should be no suppression by businesses or the administrators for them of negative reviews. Everything should be dealt with in the same way. Importantly, all reviews must be moderated pre or post publication, and fake reviews must be dealt with swiftly and effectively when they are identified. However, unless they are fraudulent or in breach of terms and conditions, they shouldn't be removed except by the author, who may be able to edit or request removal. And in all cases, it's not just a case of protecting consumers, it's a case of protecting suppliers as well. So suppliers should always have a right to respond, which should also be subject to moderation. And finally, I'll have a quick talk about a standard that again is very recently published on e-commerce transactions. So just to talk about the benefits and risks of e-commerce. So to businesses, there are reduced overheads, no rent on physical premises, for example. So buying online can have many benefits. Access to greater number of customers, including international customers. So it's not just that consumers get to buy internationally, businesses benefit from consumers buying internationally. And there's no need for traders to store products in bulk as they can order from suppliers as required. Consumers benefit from lower prices, greater convenience, access to more sellers, greater choice. They have that access to information and rating reviews at their fingertips, and they have the ability to feedback and to name and shame. As we talked about earlier in some of the overarching risks of digital global markets, a lack of consumer trust can lead to lost sales if things don't go well. Negative public feedback can lead to reputational damage, and returned unsuitable items can provide cost to business. So I think there's a famous example of someone whose boyfriend bought a sofa for their new house that turned out to be a doll's house sofa. So obviously it did have to be returned. I think you might have questioned just how cheap that sofa was, but clearly he just thought he'd got a bargain. And for consumers, there's no face-to-face contact with the trader. So you can't have discussions about what you're buying. You can't inspect those items before purchase, which is exactly why that doll's house sofa was a problem. You're often required to pay in advance of receipts. So you might be out of pocket for something you turn out not to want. And you can feel detached from those purchases. So you might be more likely to overspend than you would in a store, potentially an increased risk of fraud or other criminal activity, and more opportunities for people to make mistakes when they're buying online. So there are pros and cons to the online purchasing world. But the standard solution for that is a standard on making sure that, or providing guidelines for business to consumer electronic commerce transactions to make sure that they follow best practice as much as possible. So ISO 10008 provides guidance for planning, designing, developing, implementing, maintaining, and improving an effective and efficient business to consumer e-commerce transaction system. So I think what that very lengthy title indicates is that the process needs to be considered, and the impact on a consumer, the consumer journey needs to be considered at all stages of purchase, both from the very early information gathering stage right through to the potential for redress. So this was one that we got involved at systemic review stage, and we as CPIN strongly pushed for the standard to be revised when it came up for systemic review, because a lot had changed in the time since it had first been published, and actually changed quite a lot even during the time we were developing it as a result of the increased digitalization of shopping during the COVID pandemic. But what it's done is it offers guidelines for reinforcing the safety of personal data, provides best practice for payment security, ensures that where possible, consumers are able to make an informed choice, for example, of contact methods, and ensures that there are clear processes for complaints and dispute resolution. And for business, it provides that clear guidance to provide an experience that makes customers want to use services again and ensures the minimisation of customer complaints. And that is it from me. And so we can now open the floor up to questions.
Thanks, Ceri. It's really interesting to hear about those three. We don't actually have any questions, which means that you were so thorough and gave a good explanation of everything.
And you, Julie, yeah.
Nobody has any questions. So we'll just give a few seconds for people to type something in if they want to. We do have one question. Shall I because you haven't quite moved from the slide yet, let's just have a quick look at that. Internal customers captured in these standards, or is it only external? I can quickly, when we're talking about representing consumers, one thing that we do take into account on all the things we work on is that to us, that includes existing customers, but also potential customers. So, all of the standards that we work on, we're trying to encourage a business to think about not just the customers that they have at present, but things like accessibility or design. They should be thinking about all the potential customer groups, as well as those who are existing. I'm hoping for now that answers the question. If not, feel free to add another one. Let's just take this question from Charlie. The standards look great, but are reliant on uptake. How feasible is it that organisations will adopt these standards without being forced by other measures? Yes, you're right, standards are voluntary. If I use the consumer vulnerability example, regulators have promoted that standard, as I said, as a way for firms to demonstrate that they're doing the right thing, and that can really help to increase uptake. But we do hope that as long as awareness is there of the standards and how they can offer benefits, that organisations that want to do the right thing will be adopting the standards, because it is a way of them demonstrating, and it does make a difference. It makes a difference to the quality of the service that they're providing. It makes a difference in terms of, how satisfied their customers are. So we do believe that there are lots of benefits to organisations using standards, and it's just about raising awareness of those, really, to encourage the take-up would be my answer. Do you want to add anything to that, Ceri?
I don't think so, Jo. I think you've been pretty comprehensive insofar as, we agree that the standards are great across the board. And just to echo your point that if awareness is raised that the standards exist, that we think it's in companies' best interest to adopt them. So it's really about reinforcing how it can help them, and in some cases help their bottom line. And we gave a number of examples of why it can, protect their reputation, reduce costly complaints. And I think those are the things that really need reinforcing, gain them more business if they're to be encouraged to take them up.
Thank you. There's one final question, Ceri, which I think is about the growing problem of unsafe products on online marketplaces. And we recognise that as an issue. Is there anything that you want to say about that?
Yeah, it is a really tricky one, and there is a limit to what standards can do. It can't prohibit criminal behaviour. That's not the role of standards. That's the role of law and of regulation. And so there's clearly action that needs to be taken in some cases by regulators and governments and enforcement agencies. We do know that our member of our consumer forum, which has done a lot of work around fake reviews on marketplaces, and including Amazon, but other marketplaces as well. So another key point is to raise that, and they play a really key role in raising consumer awareness of the issue. So I think there is a multi-pronged approach, but where standards and businesses can definitely play a role in making sure that their monitoring of the products that are sold on their sites is fully up to scratch. And Amazon and other organizations that sell third-party products absolutely need to up their game in that regard, and standards can potentially play a role in helping them know what they need to do that. Yeah.
Good point, Ceri. And also, I know that there's a live investigation at the moment into Amazon and online marketplaces by the Competition and Markets Authority. So it is something, product safety is something that's really top of mind, I'd say, for those working in consumer protection, and how easy it is to buy those products online is something that we really need to look at. But as Ceri says, it's like a multi-pronged approach, really, with legislation, regulation, and then also standards to provide that best practice guidance as well. Thank you. So I think that's all the questions that we have at the moment. Let's move on, shall we, and just close up the session. Thank you very much for your questions, everybody. So hopefully throughout the session, we've been able to demonstrate to you the value of consumer participation in standards, the wide range of consumer needs, experiences and behaviour that need to be taken into account when developing standards for all products and services that have an impact on consumers at some point down the line. Hopefully you've also been able to explain to you how CPIN and the Consumer Forum working together make sure that consumers are at the heart of standards, and how we can provide that valuable insight into the standards process to help shape standards and to minimise risks for consumers, and also the benefits that there are for businesses, and that input is informed by evidence and data and by consumer experts. So all of this really just strengthens standards and helps BSI to deliver on its commitment to have a unique multi-stakeholder approach. So hopefully we've been able to explain to you how that works and why it's important. So just a couple more slides to finish off. So how can we all make it easier for consumer stakeholders to get involved in the standards development process? There's a few things really that we just wanted to highlight. It's really important to have early engagement with consumer stakeholders, because we really need to be at the table when things like the scope is being developed, when you're identifying what the key issues are that a standard might address. Also, it's about being mindful that consumers, as we were saying, are often an underrepresented stakeholder who may have limited resources. And sometimes standards developers may need to adapt their approach accordingly to make sure that the consumer voice can be heard. So we talk, when we're having conversations with BSI, with standards development managers, we're helping them to understand how they can use innovative and flexible methods to engage the consumer stakeholder. And we've made use quite often of things like consumer stakeholders and roundtables at the beginning of the standards process, which is something that we did before the consumer vulnerability standard, as I said, to get all of those stakeholders together in the room to gather insight at the beginning of the process as to what the key issues are, what the risks are, and to make sure they are fed into the standard. Other things, smart agendas. We've been using CPIN collaboration. If we don't have enough reps to take on one particular standard, we've got 2 or 3 sometimes working together on a standard so they can share the workload. And another thing that's really important to make sure that consumer stakeholders and representatives can feel involved is having an inclusive culture and processes. And that's just about raising awareness within committees about the value of the multi-stakeholder approach and why the consumer representative is important and kind of why they're there, and making sure that meetings are accessible as well. It's just about making sure that everybody has an equal opportunity to speak up, whilst realising that some may find it more difficult than others to speak up. So there's just a few things that we can do to facilitate consumer participation. So if you would like to find out more about the work that we do, if you want to find out more about CPIN or the BSI Consumer Forum, just like to encourage you to take a look at our consumer pages on the BSI website. You can see the link there, bsigroup.com/consumers. And on that website, we have lots of information. We have lots of free consumer leaflets. We have leaflets on each of our 5 priority areas where we talk about why they are important and the sorts of work we do in those areas. So that's sustainability, inclusion, digital, lots of the things that we've spoken about today. And we also have leaflets that cover some of our key consumer standards and, why they came about, how they help protect consumers, and what's in them. And there are things like online reviews, and the consumer vulnerability standard. We have leaflets for those. You can read them or download them for free. And we also have a CPIN podcast series. So if you work for BSI, you'll realise that they have an excellent podcast. And we have our own series called Consumers and Standards, where we cover some of our key priority areas. So please do take a look at those, or take a listen of those. And if there's anything at all that you would like to ask us that you feel that we haven't answered today, if you'd like to know about any of the work that we're doing, how to get involved, any questions at all, then please feel free to contact the BSI consumer team. And you can contact them at consumer@bsigroup.com. So thank you very, very much. We really appreciate you coming along to our webinar and for listening, and also for engaging with the polls and engaging with the Q&A as well. So it's really nice to know that you're actually there and that we're able to get that feedback. And thank you so much. Really hope that you found the session interesting as well. So thank you on behalf of myself and Ceri. Thank you very much. And we hope you enjoy the rest of the day and the rest of the conference. Thank you.